It started with a tariff, a 30% U.S. tariff, to be exact, slapped onto Canadian furniture imports during the Trump administration's sweeping push for protectionism. For Holsag, a long-standing Canadian furniture brand based in Lindsay, Ontario, this policy wasn't just political noise. It was a direct threat to their bottom line. After 35 years of manufacturing chairs and tables for schools, hotels, and public institutions across North America, Holsag made a decision that would end up redefining and unraveling everything. They shut down their Canadian operations and moved production to Utah. What looked like a clean strategic move turned out to be a slow-motion corporate implosion.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
On the surface, the plan seemed sound. By shifting production to the U.S., Holsag could theoretically bypass the tariffs and stay competitive in their biggest export market. They weren't alone. Many companies faced with new trade barriers considered similar moves. But Holsag didn't just shift a few distribution routes. They gutted their identity in the process. And that was the first red flag. Holsag wasn't just a furniture manufacturer. It was a Canadian furniture manufacturer. That Made in Canada label had been a core part of its appeal. It was shorthand for craftsmanship, quality, and national pride. It meant something to their customers, many of whom had been loyal clients for decades. So when that label suddenly vanished, so did the trust. Institutions who had built procurement relationships with Holsag over the years didn't take the news lightly. The company's Canadian identity wasn't just marketing, it was a reason to choose them over competitors. And now that identity was gone, contracts were canceled, clients moved on, revenue dropped by 25 to 30%. And it didn't end there. The expected cost savings from moving to Utah, they didn't materialize. In fact, the move increased costs. Despite operating in the U.S., Holsag remained heavily reliant on Canadian materials. Wood, upholstery, and parts still had to cross the border, subject to the very logistical delays and expenses they were trying to avoid. So now, instead of paying tariffs on finished products, they were paying more to ship raw materials across international lines to a facility that was more expensive to run. Labor costs in Utah weren't the bargain they hoped for either. Add in an infrastructure setup that went 18% over budget, and the economic logic behind the move quickly started to crumble. Lead times ballooned. What used to be a standard 3-week delivery became 8 weeks. That kind of delay in institutional furniture doesn't just frustrate clients, it drives them to competitors. And the longer Holsag stayed in this operational mess, the harder it became to recover the brand's reputation. In their rush to escape tariffs, Holsag had created a perfect storm. Higher input costs, slower production, and a decimated identity. It was a textbook example of reactive decision-making gone wrong. Meanwhile, their home country was building a different kind of response. Canada's federal government, rather than encouraging companies to flee economic pressure, invested in helping them stay. The $5 billion Industrial Resilience Fund was launched, offering targeted support to manufacturers impacted by global trade shifts. Paired with the Buy Canadian campaign, it was a full-on national effort to preserve and modernize domestic industry. Companies that stayed in Canada found themselves with new incentives, new procurement pipelines, and growing customer support. They didn't lose their Made in Canada advantage, they leaned into it. And as Holsag struggled to gain traction in the U.S., their former competitors were securing long-term contracts at home and expanding to less volatile markets in Europe and Asia. Because while Washington doubled down on protectionism, adding more tariffs through the 2025 Protection Act, Canada shifted focus. It strengthened internal manufacturing, diversified its export strategy, and made it easier for local businesses to scale globally. Holsag, on the other hand, became a company without a home. No longer Canadian enough to benefit from domestic loyalty, and not American enough to navigate U.S. protectionist policy with ease. Holsag found itself stuck between two economies going in opposite directions. The company had tried to pick a side but chose the wrong one at the worst time. What's most revealing is that Holsag's original goal-cutting costs never actually happened. Input costs went up by 8 to 10%. Operational delays drove customer dissatisfaction, and the premium customers were once happy to pay for Canadian-made quality. It was gone the moment that label disappeared. It's easy to underestimate how quickly a brand can lose everything when it severs its roots. Holsag was never flashy. It didn't ride on trends. It built its reputation on dependability and national pride. But the second it walked away from that, the market responded, and it wasn't kind. The bigger lesson here is about how companies respond to uncertainty. Protectionism can spark panic. Tariffs are designed to hurt, and they often succeed in doing just that. But reacting with abrupt, ill-considered moves only compounds the damage. Holsag could have responded differently. They could have tapped into Canadian support, modernized operations at home, and kept the brand identity that had carried them for decades. Instead, they tried to outrun a storm and ended up in a worse one. And Holsag's story is far from unique. As the global economy continues to fragment, more and more companies are being forced to make choices about where and how they operate. But what Holsag shows us is that how you adapt matters more than where you go. Crossing a border doesn't fix supply chains. It doesn't rebuild trust. It doesn't preserve legacy. And it doesn't guarantee profit. What it does if done without a comprehensive plan is expose you to new costs, to new expectations, to new failures. Holsag thought they were protecting their business, but in doing so, they lost what made it worth protecting. Now they're just another company trying to claw their way back to relevance. But when you burn bridges with your customers, your community, and your country, it's a long way back. Let us know what you think. Should Holsag have stayed and weathered the storm with Canada's help, or was the move justified given the economic climate? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like the video if you're into deep dives on corporate chaos, and don't forget to share and subscribe, because when brands break under pressure, we'll be right here unpacking every detail. Holsag's unraveling didn't happen overnight, but once it started, there was no stopping it. The decision to leave Canada was framed as a calculated move, something rational, something necessary. But what it turned into was a masterclass in corporate self-sabotage. Because they didn't just move their factory, they moved out of the narrative that had made them matter. For 3.5 decades, Holsag had stood as a symbol of Canadian durability. Their furniture wasn't just in rooms, it was in institutions, offices, schools, libraries. Their brand had integrity. And that's not something you can pack into a shipping container and relocate. It's built over time, reinforced with trust, and deeply tied to place. When they left Lindsay, Ontario, they didn't just relocate. They severed ties with the very identity they'd spent years cultivating. And what's worse, they had a choice. At the exact moment Holsag was making its break for the border, the Canadian government was preparing a completely different kind of response. A long-term one. Instead of scrambling in the face of American protectionism, Canada took a breath and made a plan. The $5 billion Industrial Resilience Fund wasn't just a bailout. It was a forward-facing investment in the future of domestic manufacturing. And for companies willing to adapt instead of flee, it offered support, stability, and strategy. Paired with the Buy Canadian campaign, the message couldn't have been clearer. We'll help you stay strong, right here. But Holsag said no. They went south, literally, betting that moving production to Utah would cut costs, speed up delivery, and protect their margins. And for a brief moment, maybe it felt like the right call. Until the invoices rolled in. The reality. Their infrastructure overhaul went 18% over budget. The cost of moving operations across the border and rebuilding them was massively underestimated. Training new workers, installing new production systems, re-establishing workflows, it wasn't quick, and it wasn't cheap. Then came the supply chain chaos. Even though they were now assembling products in the US, Holsag still depended heavily on Canadian materials, which meant that every chair, every table, was the result of cross-border coordination. Raw goods traveling from Canada into the US, subject to border delays, freight costs, customs checks, exactly the kind of logistical headaches the relocation was supposed to eliminate. And with lead times increasing from 3 weeks to 8, it became obvious they hadn't solved a problem. They'd created a new one. Customers didn't wait around to see how it would play out. Long-standing clients, many of them institutional buyers who value consistency above all else, cut ties. Some because of the delays, others because of the price hikes, but most because Holsag was no longer what they trusted it to be. Without Made in Canada stamped on their product, the emotional connection vanished. And with it, the loyalty. Holsag's revenue dropped by 25 to 30%, a hit they simply hadn't prepared for. That's the thing no one wants to talk about when it comes to brand equity. Once you damage it, there's no easy recovery. And Holsag's brand wasn't built on innovation or trendiness. It was built on dependability, craftsmanship, and national pride. By removing the Canadian identity, they gutted their own positioning. They became generic. And in a globalized market full of cheaper options, generic doesn't stand a chance. What makes this even harder to watch is how completely they misread the moment. Because while Holsag was shrinking into itself trying to find shelter from US tariffs, Canada was opening up. Ottawa wasn't just protecting the status quo. It was actively diversifying the country's export strategy, strengthening trade with Europe, building ties with Asia, making sure that Canadian manufacturers weren't boxed into a dependent relationship with the US. Holsag could have been part of that future. A legacy brand, modernizing within a supportive policy framework, still rooted in its community, but expanding globally. Instead, they are now a company caught between systems, no longer protected by Canadian loyalty and not fully embraced by the American one. Even worse, the US environment they entered became even more protectionist. The 2025 Protection Act added more barriers, more tariffs, more unpredictability. What started as a move towards stability landed Holsag in the middle of an even more volatile landscape. And now, they're boxed in. They can't easily return to Canada. It would require rebuilding facilities, re-establishing their workforce, and admitting defeat. But staying in Utah means continuing to bleed money and relevance. They've already lost so much identity, customer loyalty, market share, and there's no obvious path forward that doesn't involve more pain. That's the trap of a reactionary business strategy. It feels urgent in the moment. It feels like survival. But in the long run, it often makes things worse. Holsag's story is a lesson in how not to respond to global pressure. Because yes, tariffs are tough. Protectionism can hurt. But identity matters. Strategy matters. Running is not always the answer. The companies that did best in this environment weren't the ones who scrambled, they were the ones who stayed calm, who adjusted their sourcing, reorganized their logistics, took advantage of federal support, and crucially, kept their identity intact. Because when customers know who you are and trust what you stand for, they give you space to adapt. But when you show them that your values are flexible, that your brand story can be rewritten on short notice, they move on. That's what happened here. Holsag broke the story its customers believed in, and the fallout was instant. The irony, the move they made to protect their business, is the very thing that unraveled it. Now, Holsag is an example used in boardrooms and business schools. A company that chased short-term savings and ended up with long-term losses. A brand that tried to dodge trade policy and ended up losing its market. A name that once meant quality and reliability and now just means mistake. So where does that leave them? They still operate, but not with the same trust, not with the same legacy. They're in recovery mode, trying to win back customers who already replaced them, trying to rebuild a reputation that may no longer fit the product they offer. And the Canadian furniture market. It moved on. With government support, local manufacturers held their ground, modernized, and took market share. Some even expanded internationally, leveraging the exact strategies Holsag walked away from. There's a larger point here about navigating global uncertainty. Trade wars aren't going away. Protectionist policy is becoming more common. The companies that survive won't be the ones who run, they'll be the ones who adapt, who innovate, who understand that identity and values aren't just branding their business assets. And the thing about reputation, it travels faster than shipping delays ever will. Once word spread that Holsag was no longer Canadian-made, the reaction was immediate. Industry buyers started asking questions. Procurement officers re-evaluated contracts. And in a market where trust is everything, there's nothing worse than hesitation. The second customers start second-guessing whether your product is worth it, you're already losing them. For Holsag, the problem wasn't just that they moved, it was how they moved. There was no strong messaging, no clear narrative, no real effort to reassure customers. The decision came off like it was made in a boardroom vacuum, completely disconnected from the people who actually kept the business alive. The ones placing the orders, the ones promoting the brand, the ones telling others, go with Holsag, they're reliable. They weren't reliable anymore. Not in delivery, not in quality, and certainly not in values. Because when you sell national identity as part of your product and then strip it away without warning, people notice. And they don't forget. That's what so many companies underestimate when they lean on heritage branding. Made in Canada isn't just a tagline, it's a social contract. It says you believe in local jobs, domestic quality standards, and accountability. It's the reason institutions feel good about spending that little extra. Not for luxury but for trust. When Holsag gave that up, they didn't just lose a marketing angle, they lost a bond. And once that was broken, nothing else worked. The logistical delays, the cost increases, the longer lead times, those weren't just operational hiccups anymore. They became symptoms of a company in decline. Customers were no longer willing to give the benefit of the doubt, because Holsag had already shown them that the foundation had cracked. And while all of this was unraveling, the Canadian manufacturing scene was doing the exact opposite. Thanks to Ottawa's policy shift, domestic manufacturers were thriving. The Industrial Resilience Fund gave them the breathing room they needed to compete in a turbulent trade environment. The Buy Canadian campaign didn't just rally consumer sentiment, it shifted real purchasing decisions. Companies that stayed local suddenly had more access to funding, bigger procurement pipelines, and a growing sense of public support. Some Canadian furniture companies even expanded during this time. They didn't cut and run, they upgraded. They leaned into automation. They improved supply chains. They explored European and Asian markets where Canadian-made goods are still seen as premium. That could have been Holsag. They had the name recognition, the customer base, the legacy. All the pieces were in place for them to evolve into a modern success story. But instead of betting on reinvention, they bet on escape. And escape has a cost. Because the US wasn't some safe harbor, it was a moving target. The same protectionist wave that prompted Holsag's move didn't stop after they arrived. The 2025 Protection Act pushed even harder, introducing more trade complications, higher compliance burdens, and tighter sourcing regulations. Holsag didn't walk into stability, they walked into a storm. They weren't protected, they were exposed. And without a strong identity to fall back on, the business simply couldn't justify itself in the new environment. Worse still, their Canadian customers didn't follow them. The assumption that clients would stay loyal just because of past relationships was wildly optimistic. Loyalty in B2B markets depends on consistency, not nostalgia. And once Holsag could no longer offer consistent value on price, delivery, or principle, those contracts vanished. Let us know what you think. Was Holsag's relocation a tactical move that simply failed to land, or did they fundamentally misunderstand their value to the market? Should more companies take the risk of staying local even under pressure? Drop your thoughts in the comments, like this if you're into the gritty reality of business decisions gone wrong, and subscribe for more stories where identity, policy, and pride collide. Because every brand has a story, and some don't end well. Thanks so much for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, you're officially part of the small percentage of people who don't just click away, and that means a lot. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts, your ideas, or even what you'd like to see next. I read every single one of them, and your feedback genuinely shapes the direction of this channel. If you enjoyed the video, tap that like button, it tells YouTube this content is worth sharing. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. We've got more exciting videos coming, and trust me, you'll want to be here for them. This channel is just getting started, and your support helps it grow faster than you realize. Thank you again for spending a part of your day here with me. Stay curious, stay motivated, and as always, take care of yourself. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video.